right there. To remember bitter history means to prevent its repetition. As world leaders gathered together to commemorate the 100th anniversary since the guns of World War I fell silent, hundreds of thousands whose contributions in World War I shouldn't be forgotten, including the 114,000 Chinese liberals who served on the Western front line. But today, the risk has never dissipated, with a planet full of constant regional conflicts, traditional and non-traditional security issues, and internal polarization, as well as violence. So what is the essence of remembering World War I today, after 100 years? What can be done to cherish peace while remembering bitter history? And how can the international community improve global governance when encountering rising challenges and dangers? To discuss these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Harvey Zordin, a senior fellow with the think tank Center of China and Globalization, and Yang Xiyu, a senior fellow with the China Institute of International Studies. We shall also cross over to speak to Professor Jove Toka of the American Graduate School in Paris via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. While Chinese nationals in their millions are so busy doing shopping on November the 11th, that's a big harvest, by the way, world leaders gathered in Paris to commemorate the 100th anniversary. The question, number one, is how important it is to maintain and protect peace today when the divided world is united in the spirit of protecting peace.
Well, I think the importance doesn't lie in the remembrance of those who lost their lives, of course their valuable lives in the war. But more important thing is to draw a lesson to prevent, just as you mentioned at the very beginning, say, prevent the current situation from repeating the bitter history.
So commemoration means to avoid repeating stupid mistakes. But do you think people, particularly senior politicians around the world, are clearly aware of the challenges ahead?
I don't think so at all. I think back to what George Santayana said, and that is those who don't remember and learn from the mistakes of history are bound to repeat them. We've seen this time and time again. We are in a very situation now, a real situation where especially China and the U.S. are going toe-to-toe more often and leading down the path of the Thucydides trap to a situation that both sides would want to avoid and that the world would want to avoid, because unlike World War I, the consequences now are irrevocable and total.
It is important affair, of course, to single out politicians the world over in outlining their responsibilities, in underlining their responsibilities, maintaining peace and stability, overlooking their important leadership. Now, Mr. Dominique de Villepin, former Prime Minister of France, said wisely that peace is the job of everyone, everyone's job.
Yeah.
Was he actually referring to the issue of nationalism in the 21st century when issues of territorial integrity flared up and continue to capture headlines?
Yeah, actually, you are touching a very key words or key phenomenon all over the world, say, rising nationalism. I'm afraid almost every major countries in the world experiencing the trend of rising nationalism with the different formats or types. And the problem is, when we are in the trend, in the rising nationalism, nobody, or at least most of the people, don't realize that such a trend will lead to a very dangerous direction towards conflicts, just as the history between end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. The different type of nationalism led to conflicts and World War II. And now we are at the very critical historical crossroad. We can go either a new era of peace, reliable peace, or we will repeat the history. And unfortunately, the world order now is in transition. Whenever the world order or regional order is in transition, the danger or probability of the conflicts are always much higher than the normal period.
In fact, Xi put his finger on a very important issue of the alleged instability in the early stage of a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is actually used here to refer to perhaps rebuilding a world order that becomes increasingly flawed with the emergence of so many major economies. Having said this, Harvey, what do you think of the speeches of President Emmanuel Macron, who hosts the ceremony? What do you think of particularly the transatlantic tensions over the issue of military spending?
I thought President Macron's words were inspirational, and that people should pay attention to them. He said that patriotism is the opposite of nationalism, for example. And he would like to establish a new world order, and has actually set up an organization, the Paris peace meetings, to do this. So I think this is really necessary at this time, because you have President Trump and other nationalists who are going in the other direction, going in their own way. And I also thought it was reprehensible that while the European leaders seemed to pull together during the ceremony, that the one exception was President Trump, who because of a few raindrops, didn't go to honor the troops who gave their lives. And I think this is very indicative of his very narrow-minded thinking.
Thank you so much. Peace is, of course, a loaded concept, and is featured increasingly prominently in today's media coverage about what could happen next in the future. Let me cross over to Professor Geoffrey Tolka with the American Graduate School in Paris. He's standing by in Paris, and of course he has witnessed what happened there between and among the senior politicians. Hello, Mr. Tolka. My question is, what do you think of the words in President Emmanuel Macron's speech? He says, let me quote, he says, "Let us build our hopes rather than fears against each other. Together we can avert threats, the specter of global warming, poverty, hunger, disease, inequality, and ignorance." That's what he said at the commemoration ceremony. What do you think of the implications of his policy speech?
Well, this is indeed the second major central point in President Macron's address to the Paris Peace Forum, which, by the way, is intended to continue and actually to convene every year come November 11th. We still will have to see whether that's going to be this way, but it is that the intention, namely to create, in a way, a new international organization or institution which would be devoted to preventing bloody conflict. Well, not to fear is in a way a complementary element to the other major strong idea in President Macron's speech, which you just dealt with in Beijing, namely patriotism is actually an opposite value in regard to nationalism, not to confuse the two. And actually, if you are a real patriot, tries to say President Macron, then you have to turn your back to nationalism, because nationalism is not the way you express your attachment to your homeland. I mean, that's exactly the way in 1914 world leaders, European leaders rather, made the succession of mistakes which brought upon the world this huge massacre, right, which in a way launched this kind of bloody modernity over battlefields.
Yes, indeed.
It is so
yes, indeed.
important to avoid.
The far-right movement rises on the platform of nationalism. If you look at the results of Brexit, Italian elections, and what happened in Greece a couple of years back. The same is true with Brazilian politics across the Pacific Ocean. Now, very often, it is not those who attend the major forum or ceremony that captures more headlines. It is those who are absent from the activity that would trigger more debates. For example, President Donald Trump is absent from the Peace Forum that was held in Paris to commemorate the bloody First World War. What do you make of the absence of American leadership upon this very important occasion?
Yeah, well, that's in a way symbolizing and actually leading, if you wish, that other current in world global options and diplomacies, the behavior of President Trump. But let me just remind you, for the sake of historic perspective, don't forget that America's involvement in world affairs is not a constant value and a constant fact in American history. We had to wait until the second decade of 20th century, namely the last final phases of World War I, for America to actually come out of its shores.
You're right, Mr. Toker, you are right that the United States is not remembered very often when it comes to the First World War. However, what happened in the aftermath of the First World War is important for the whole world. For example, President Woodrow Wilson helped to construct the World League, and the founding principles of this multilateral body did lay out some of the important notions for maintaining peace, except for the issue of Qingdao in China. And by the way, up to 114,000 Chinese liberals were involved in the First World War, and yet China seems to have been forgotten ally. And the same is true for China in the Second World War. Do you think this is an issue of racial discrimination, or do you think politicians in the West are very selective in commemorating history?
Well, I think the ignorance of China's contribution and China's status as a winner in the war stem from not racist or Western nationalism, but stem from the game of balance of power among a very few big powers. They only pay special attention to not only their own interests, but also the other major powers' interests, and meanwhile ignore and throw away the other countries' interests. So in short, inequality arrangement actually plant a seed for the next round of the conflicts. So that is one of the serious lessons we should draw from the World War I.
Today, the Peace Forum is well underway in Paris, but remember what happened 100 years ago in Paris. Yet another Paris Peace Forum caused massive protests in the streets of Chinese cities. Particularly Chinese students took out to the street in protest against the unfair, humiliating terms implied in the agreement that was inked between politicians in the West. Today, however, when China reflects upon the lessons we draw from the two world wars, China says, look, we got to build our own military. And yet we draw fire, scrutiny, mistrust on many issues such as South China Sea. They forget China is ready to provide public products and public service in doing that, and in shaping freedom of navigation to protect such freedom. Why do you think China is always comes across as a controversial country? And at the same time, in the case of two world wars, we have been forgotten, we have been underestimated.
Well, I think in the case of World War I, it was a case of China being weak, but every cloud has a silver lining, and that did lead to the student protests.
China was weak, therefore, do we have good reasons to turn our military into a strong one in preserving peace?
As Lord Palmerston said, there's no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And so you have to always go with your national interest. countries, in the absence of a world government, in the absence of worldwide disarmament, which are dreams that in my view will never happen, every country has an obligation to its government, to its people, to protect itself. It's almost the first rule of any government is to protect its people.
Right. A general from the National Defense University of the PLA Armed Forces said 3 years ago on a very important occasion that weak national defense means poor quality of peace. Now, looking back at the Opium War, why Europeans invaded Beijing and looted, set ablaze the Yuanmingyuan Garden. Now, these memories about the humiliation of China did alert the whole nation to the fact that we do need a strong military. So what do you think of China's vows to protect the peace and stability?
Well, through China's history, bitter history, during past more than 100 years, and also based on the existing reality, Chinese people as well as the government really have a big lesson. Say we need to strengthen constantly our military capability to defend our national interests from being repeated by the history. But on the other hand, we have been in a new age. So now Chinese government and Chinese people pay more attention to the international cooperation based on the equality, national sovereignty equality with both big countries and small countries. So basically we have two legs. One leg is to strengthen our military capability to defend our country. But on the other hand, we pay more and more resources and attention to strengthen the international cooperation. So in short, peace by international cooperation.
For example, the anti-piracy flotilla in Somali waters helped provide public products in escorting international oil tanks in this area. Let me cross back to Professor Toka. What do you think of the importance of strengthening the Franco-German axis during the absence of United Kingdom and, of course, the weak U.S. leadership regarding the issue of military spending? You know what I'm talking about, the concern that President Donald Trump pointed out on the campaign trail. So the issue of unity between France and Germany in safeguarding a possible threat that allegedly comes from, Russia.
This is essential. It is essential through the Russian perspective. I mean, regarding the position of Russia and the threats or potential threats coming from Russia, or just the politics of fait accompli, which Russia, for example, had accomplished and still working on in Crimea and towards the Ukraine. It is essential indeed in the context of this President Trump's mandate. We don't know how long that will last, and we don't know how deep that will go, and we don't know what will be the spillovers of Mr. Trump's initiatives, or indeed lack of initiatives, retreat from initiatives. And it is the Franco-German axis essential in the European immediate context of Brexit, and perhaps also in terms of what is happening in Italy and what is happening in 3-4 other countries in which we see parties from the extreme right or even the neo-fascist movement participating in power within the European countries. So nothing has ever happened significantly with the European presence on world affairs without the French-German voluntary and efficient cooperation. This is the case today for the same reasons it was valid 20, 30 and 50 years ago, and maybe more so today.
When we look into the future, of course, we focus on the next round of NATO expansion. Now, the first round of eastward expansion took place in the early 1990s. The 3 Baltic states were the first batch of those former states of the Soviet Empire that were recruited by NATO. Those prospective members that might be hopefully recruited by the NATO could include Ukraine, Georgia. What do you think of the concerns of Russians Russians have done their best to prevent Kiev from being recruited. And of course, the same could be said about Georgia. What do you think of the Russian concerns? Russia felt strongly in the early 1990s, particularly when Boris Yeltsin was the president, that Moscow had been humiliated and were humiliated deliberately by the US-led transatlantic alliance.
Is the question put to me?
It's a question for Mr. Toker. For Mr. Toker, what do you think of the
yes, I think
enlargement of NATO?
I think there are two vectors here which should we may try to follow in order to understand and contextualize your question and the answer to it. On one hand, don't forget what Russia is doing on the terrain. Let it be in Ukraine, let it be in Crimea, let it be indeed regarding what may be happening in Georgia, etc. On the other hand, let's remember that Russia right now is the object of international sanctions on the part of Americans, on the part of the European Union. So President Putin's overall diplomacy is navigating between these two vectors, and I would say, objectively speaking, that navigating with a lot of talent in that. Because look at, for example, the say of Russia and the influence in Russia in regions such as the Middle East, over the Syrian crisis, even over the Yemenite situations. Russia is talking to practically everybody in spite of that special status of under sanction. So the quality of Russian diplomacy seems to be rather high, especially given those special and heavy burdening circumstances in which it is finding itself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toker. Xi Yu, in his speech, President Vladimir Putin seemed to be pretty quiet and calm regarding the just concluded massive military drills on the doorsteps of Russia under the stare of the polar bear. He looked very calm. What do you think of the policy options on the table for Moscow?
Well, I think Moscow now is facing increasing security pressures from the NATO. So in my eye, they are conducting excuse me, dual tactics. On one hand, they show the stronger reaction against the strong reaction by military drills. But on the other hand, as you said, quiet means he's conducting a peace diplomacy by making use of this great opportunity, say, remembering of the World War I to draw lesson for durable peace in Europe, in the world. So basically, Putin's performance in this event is great.
I think that Putin may be holding his own counsel, but I believe that he is directing a information or disinformation war in America and in Europe, which is designed to sow dissension among America's allies, Europeans, etc. And it's having some impact. It certainly destabilized the United States after the Russian interventions in the election in 2016. There's evidence that Russia is involved in Europe in these kinds of dirty tricks. So I think he may be smiling like a Cheshire cat, but I believe that he's also directing other activities which aren't so benign.
Undeniably, Mr. Toker, undeniably, East Ukraine as well as Crimea are regarded as the factors of instability and unpredictability for Europe. But when we look at the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in Northeast Asia, we have 4 major flashpoints. The divided Korean Peninsula, the 4 northern islands between Russia and Japan, Diaoyu Islands, and Taiwan. Of course, you can include the South China Sea. Having said this, let's look at yet another very consequential bilateral relationship. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to visit China, but this man, this politician, said a few years ago, when the two countries were still mired in disputes over Diaoyu Islands, that the behavior of China was very much like Germany ahead of the First World War. And the two countries had been on loggerheads as a result. So what do you think of this comparison? Of course, bilateral relationship has been improved remarkably following the official visit by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the first of its kind since 6 or maybe 8 years ago. So what do you think?
I would say that one should be cautious, prudent, and open-minded regarding this kind of comparisons which try to manipulate a little bit different contexts, different continents, different political atmosphere, different types of political regimes, and try to draw conclusions from one case, implying it potentially, hypothetically, over the other. Anyway, it is a good way, a good tool of study. And this brings us back, in a way, to where this conversation started, as to the essence and the reasons for commemorating what happened 100 years ago. When we commemorate things and when we think about other conflicts and other way of diplomatic behavior over other conflicts and other circumstances, we contextualize them. Once we contextualize them, it's easier for us to contextualize what's happening in our own area, over our own continent, or our own political structure. So this is why, in terms of study, in terms of intellectual opening, this is useful and meaningful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toke. Xi Yu, let's go back to continental Europe and European politics. Chancellor Angela Merkel, as well as Emmanuel Macron, said many times that the European Union and European countries should take matters of defense and security of the continent into their own hands. Perhaps this concern was voiced in the broad context of the American concern that it should reduce its commitments to the defense of European countries. Is it likely that the Europeans would come to terms with Russia on terms of having collective security? And what do you think of the possibility of forging collective security mechanism like OANhui, the European Security Council and Conference?
Yeah, I think firstly, the independence or relatively independent defense cooperation among European countries will be an inevitable trend across the Atlantic, although U.S. remain making efforts to strengthen the NATO. I think in future, European countries will rely on both pillars by NATO and their own defense cooperation. That will, trigger differences between U.S. and Europe. But on the other hand, European countries will conduct more and more different format efforts from the U.S. for their own security and peace by multiple ways, including the European Security and Peace Cooperation Mechanism, as well as by their own independent national defense capabilities from the United States. So basically, there will be a triangle relation between European countries, Russia, and the United States. There won't be the whole nation, whole NATO versus Russia.
In the immediate aftermath of Crimea, Chancellor Angela Merkel had employed a policy of being very practical regarding the relationship with Moscow. Was she learning from Bismarck, the former Prime Minister of Germany, who helped unite this country? Well, it's up to the politicians and their vision to unite a divided world, and China could have done more to be part of this process of peacemaking. With that, we come to the end of this edition in commemoration of the First World War, in which the huge sacrifice of China has unfortunately been forgotten or underestimated. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.